We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America from the Australia Institute. I'm Dr. Emma Shortis. I'm Senior Researcher in International and Security Affairs. 2 weeks to go. Harris and Trump are blitzing the swing states, hoping they'll be able to turn out enough votes in enough of the right places. In Georgia, early voting records are already being broken. In the blue wall states, the margins are still razor thin. According to one polling aggregator, Trump is ahead in Michigan by 1.2 points, in Wisconsin by 0.2, and in Pennsylvania by 0.8. We just don't know how this will all play out, either on election day or after. What we can do is try to understand campaign strategies and the major issues driving them, and how all of that is already affecting politics here at home. To do that, we're so pleased to welcome back a friend of the podcast and one of our very first guests, Dr. Prudence Flowers. Prudence is Senior Lecturer in US History at Flinders University and President of the Australian and New Zealand American Studies Association. Her book is called The Right to Life Movement, the Reagan Administration and the Politics of Abortion. And she's just finished her next one, which is called The Reagan Revolution, and will be out next year. Prudence and I discussed the role of social media, the world of podcasting, race and racism, immigration, gender and reproductive rights. Here she is. Hi, Prudence. Thank you so much for coming back onto the show.
Thanks for having me.
Anytime. So last time we spoke, I think it was almost the beginning of Kamala Harris's campaign for the presidency. She just kind of stitched up the nomination, and we were talking about things like what it means that Kamala is brat and how important that kind of social media, pop culture momentum was going to be for her campaign. So I wanted to ask you kind of in the intervening period, how that has gone and where the joy and where the vibes are at now, particularly online.
I think that's a great question because I don't think Kamala is brat anymore, but I don't think that was sustainable. And brat summer has, of course, come to an end for all our friends in the Northern Hemisphere, although Australia will be beginning its brat summer soon. I think it's been really interesting to think about social media strategies because the Harris campaign has such a clearly defined and really skillful social media strategy, which we haven't seen a kind of comparable version of. There was a fantastic article almost a month ago in the Washington Post, which kind of gave some insights into her social media team. And I loved the title of it, which refers to the feral 25-year-olds who run a TikTok account, which came from an insider who was not being critical. It's a compliment that he was making about this team. And it really talked about the kind of segmentation of, I guess, voters and market across social media platforms. So they talked about the fact that they create radically different content depending on platform. So Facebook essentially being for baby boomers, and that's how they approach it. Longer, more serious pieces for YouTube. But TikTok, they had some really interesting kind of insights in this piece from people working in the campaign and close to it about the ways in which the Harris team is willing to trust the people who work for it. So part of the big point of this piece was really that the feral 25-year-olds who run that account are able to get things approved generally within 30 minutes to an hour. So once they submit it, there's supposed to be a 15-minute approval time. They don't have to go through layers of approval and kind of messaging and massaging. There's a kind of faith that the TikTok audience is quite specific and that these 25-year-olds are best placed to reach that audience. And I think there's evidence of the success of that strategy because if you look at the Kamala HQ account, which is the principal kind of meme generator for the campaign, they've got about 5 million followers, but they have about 25 million likes. And so what that means is that every like puts that onto people's For You pages and kind of creates new eyes for content in a way that is unpaid for and really organic. I think the other really interesting thing that's happening with the social media strategy, obviously we've had the big high profile gets. So Taylor Swift has endorsed her. Beyonce was front and center really early on. But I think as well, there's been an interesting kind of pivot towards how do they engage with Trump. So while the mainstream Democrats seem to have backed away from Tim Walz's assertion that Republicans are weird, which I think is disappointing, really, because that seemed very successful for them. That framing is front and center on the TikTok account, where a lot of really hateful things that Trump has said are just kind of presented really sarcastically, or like he's obsessed with us, or, go off king. When he's saying really, foul or upsetting things, it's a kind of sarcastic engagement with Trump that doesn't take him seriously. And I think on the one hand, there's some value in presenting Trump as a generational threat, but that also hasn't really worked for Democrats consistently. So in some ways, not treating Trump as a serious figure, I think, is also quite an interesting strategy that seems to be front and center in some of the social media platforms.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
I just want to clarify here. You bring up Springfield, Ohio, and ABC News did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community.
Well, I've seen people on television.
Let me just say here, this is the
people on television say my dog was taken and used for food.
I got a friend calling me asking me if he has to leave because he's scared for his life.
What do you say to Haitian Americans and Haitian immigrants who say spreading false claims about them put their lives at risk?
Well, I don't think that no one has spread false claims. What they've
Prudence, often I think the social media and the role of social media, and particularly TikTok that you identified, is understood in the mainstream media as having no substance. It's all memes and pop culture, and it's not really engaging with policy. But I think, some of the social media that I see certainly contradicts that. Reproductive rights and immigration particularly are all over social media. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, immediately after the debate between Trump and Harris, Trump's claims about, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, the people in Springfield, pets are being eaten by quote unquote illegal immigrants from Haiti. That was kind of immediately turned into a variety of meme formats. One of the most popular of which was a kind of song and dance, which kind of made an almost techno version of they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. And also a variety of people either putting their pets in big stock pots and saying, well, times are tough, or, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of engagement with what he'd said, which I think indicates, on the one hand, a playfulness. It also indicates a really acute consciousness of what's happened in the debate. So this was all over social media, which I think indicates just how much people were engaging with that debate, that it immediately had traction. But it also has this flip side, which I think can sometimes be negative, where on the one hand we talk about social media as a way of talking back to power, and social media has also played important roles in various kind of political revolutions that have happened. But here what you see is a kind of playful talking back to a grotesque racial claim that Trump made. But at the same time, the legal Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, were experiencing death threats. The schools were closed down for a period of time. Businesses were closed. White supremacists were supposedly on the streets. The mayor of Springfield were kind of making statements saying, we value our Haitian residents. They're doing incredible work. We needed workers. There's this kind of real competition over these very real people who were legally in Springfield. And then to cap that off, when J.D. Vance was finally called out about the fact that he kept referring them to as illegal immigrants, he claimed that Harris and Biden had kind of made them legal through the swipe of a pen, and so that if Trump came back, he would make them illegal with the swipe of a pen, and then they could be deported. So again, this kind of tension around what is legal immigration, what is unlawful immigration, what would Trump do with these various categories of immigrants? And I think in particular, the lighthearted tone of the response to some of Trump's most hateful rhetoric during the debate, I think is a little bit alarming that that carried on for a long time, and this discussion around what was actually happening in Haiti didn't get necessarily the same amount of coverage or engagement. And so I think that is where you can have this tension around social media and podcasts, where the kind of the zeitgeisty and the now trumps, so to speak, a kind of understanding of the real world consequences of what is happening and what is being said. There was no apologies from Vance or Trump about what were repeatedly proven to be lies. In fact, they were just the complaints that they'd been fact-checked during the debates.
I think that's such an important point. And it's one that often gets lost. The gravity of it often gets lost in kind of superficial campaign coverage. I think the media still doesn't know how to deal with fascism's ability to be quite funny and ridiculous and obscene and terrifying all at once. And I want to come back to immigration, but just while we're talking about social media and media, there seems to be, I'm not sure if tension, I've been grappling with this for the last few weeks. I'm not sure if tension is the word, but when we look at the social media strategy alongside the media strategy more generally, so exactly what you were just describing is reflected in some of the media strategy, in that Harris is doing things like going on the Call Her Daddy podcast and meeting those voters exactly where they are. But at the same time, she's also going on Fox News or doing 60 Minutes and presenting to a different group of voters. And I'm wondering, is that contradictory, or is that just kind of the reality of politics in America and campaigning in the United States today?
I think that reflects the reality of campaigning now. I mean, Trump has been engaging with right-wing podcasters for some time. We won't comment on Trump's habitual home on Fox, which is obviously, again, a very receptive audience. I think on the one hand, what Harris is doing is a kind of interesting combination of mainstream media and these kind of new forums like podcasters. But I think the appearance on Fox is interesting as well. So obviously Tim Walz has been on Fox quite a bit. Pete Buttigieg is a regular Fox contributor. Democrats have sometimes had a bit of ambivalence, tension themselves about whether or not they give credence to Fox's influence. And Harris is just going all in. She's going everywhere. Yeah. And I think, she's faced a lot of criticism from quote unquote mainstream media for being frightened of interviews. That's kind of been a consistent theme. And it's an odd theme because it's not as if Trump is sitting down to that many mainstream interviews where he can't control the outcome. But I think in the last few weeks, we've seen this really a huge onslaught of interviews across platforms, including with hostile audiences. I think the Fox News interview really does everything it needed to do. She looked strong. She looked like she was willing to go into places that were hostile or adversarial. She stands up to the interviewer at one point and kind of fact-checked him on the spot. She's probably not winning that many voters from that. But given that Trump has refused to do things like 60 Minutes and has refused to engage in mainstream media in the last few weeks, there is quite a stark juxtaposition. And I think the podcasting strategy is particularly interesting because, she's not going on policy podcasts. She's going to reach undecided voters or people who haven't voted before. And Call Her Daddy had recently eclipsed the Joe Rogan podcast as the #1 podcast on Spotify. So massive audience, very engaged. And the interviews she gave there were about policy in ways that I think ordinary people can connect with. So rather than outlining, I will introduce this, I will introduce that, which does happen at the very end, she talks more about a vision of what government can and should do for women and families. And, in some ways, I felt like the Call Her Daddy interview was striking because it's so rare to hear politicians talk in a kind of a sustained and meaningful way about things like sexual violence and domestic violence and abortion. This was a very long conversation that was actually the bulk of what they were doing. All of that gives voters insights into who she is and what matters. And, she does similar things when she goes on Charlemagne the God, and she's clearly reaching out to young Black male voters there. She's on Howard Stern, who also has his own share of male listeners. They're predominantly male listeners. They're probably not as conservative as Joe Rogan's. She's reaching all these different segments and all these different demographics. I think it is incoherent, but I think this is such an incoherent election. And there's so much voter fatigue, I think, about this election that you have to go where undecided people are and unmotivated people are. And that's not going to be traditional forums.
It's still kind of disconcerting, though, to think that Joe Rogan, an appearance on a Joe Rogan podcast, which for listeners who might not be familiar is now, the second most potentially popular podcast on Spotify, and is, very kind of hyper-masculine, presents itself as non-ideological, but is clearly fairly right-wing. I think that's fair to say, isn't it, Prudence?
Yeah, that's very fair to say.
The prospect of that having a huge influence on the campaign is quite a lot to digest. What do you make of potentially both candidates going on that podcast? How do you think that would play out? Not at the same time, just to be clear, sorry.
I mean, I think if Trump goes on it, I think he'll have a very receptive interviewer and audience, and I think that's undeniable. in some ways, it's interesting that he hasn't done it before, again, since he's been on a whole bunch of male-dominated podcasts run by conservatives in the last few weeks. So once Kamala kicked off her podcast kind of agenda, he has done the same. I think it's interesting how much male voters are coming to the fore as the people that both candidates are clearly courting. So I think Harris going on Howard Stern and Charlamagne the God, both of them wanting to go on Joe Rogan, all of that is about getting male votes. I mean, it's been said all year pretty much that the reason Trump picked J.D. Vance was because he was trying to appeal to white male voters who hadn't turned out in the same way in 2020 that they did for him in 2016. I think that's really interesting that that's clearly where they both view the space to pick up votes. Again, Trump is not trying to reach people outside that white male, the male demographic. He is trying to reach non-white males. He declined the offer to go and call her daddy, for example. And the host of that show, Alex Cooper, was really clear that she had invited both candidates to be interviewed and he had refused or not got back to her. He's not trying to pick up women voters. He's not going to those places, despite his forum with women recently. They were all Republican. Many of them had already voted. Some of them were Republican Party officials. That was not an attempt to woo undecided women voters. So I think it's this perception that male voters, primarily but not exclusively white male voters, are the kind of flotsam and jetsam of the campaign who can be motivated at this point in time. I mean, I find it kind of disturbing that to do that, you have to go to Joe Rogan's podcast. He's front and center in the kind of manosphere and is pretty hostile to progressive ideas around gender and sexuality.
I'm sorry, gentlemen. I've noticed this especially with some men who seem to think Trump's behavior, the bullying and the putting people down, is a sign of strength. Real strength is about taking responsibility for your actions and telling the truth even when it's inconvenient. Real strength is about helping people who need it and standing up for those who can't always stand up for themselves. That is what we should want for our daughters and for our sons. And that is what I want to see in a president of the United States of America.
But, you know, I suppose the Harris campaign has also been foregrounding other models of masculinity through, for example, Tim Walz. And there's been a lot of ads and campaign activity from Tim Walz, which offers a different model of masculinity. I think there's been a recent ad from the patriarch in Modern Family, which ends with it's time to be a real man, vote for a woman. You know, there's a lot of that kind of framing going on, but this seems like a space that's particularly challenging. I also find it depressing, I guess, that Obama is being criticized for his comments to black male voters, that accusing them of maybe being sexist for not wanting to vote for Kamala. It's disappointing that the media just immediately dismisses that as a potential cause and that he's being told it's been claimed he's kind of damaging the campaign for bringing gender into it. And you think, well, how is it not part of what's going on, that there's a kind of river of sexism running through all of this? There can be lots of things going on, but I don't know that Obama's wrong in highlighting sexism as a reason why some men are not wanting to vote for her, or why they're holding her to a standard that is much higher than they're holding Donald Trump or other candidates.
Which, of course, is something that's consistent across the board. And I want to come back very much to the question of the gender gap. But alongside it, I think a lot of what you were talking about then, Prudence, is, of course, the issue of race as well, and when we're talking about the Trump campaign attempting to appeal predominantly to white men, clearly, but also, thinks with reason that, he has appeal with black men and particularly Latino men as well. But sitting alongside that is this fairly ingrained perception that Trump performs much more strongly on the issue of immigration. And of course, his incredibly hard line on that issue is using the most appallingly racist language and, has a policy platform that the kind of flagship line is the biggest mass deportations in American history. This is pretty extraordinary stuff.
You've said that you're going to carry out, quote, the largest domestic deportation operation in American history, unquote.
He opened the borders. Nobody's ever seen anything like. And we have to get a lot of these people out, and we have to get them out fast because they're going to destroy our country. And you know who's being hurt the most by millions of people pouring into our country? The black population and the Hispanic population. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country.
You've written about the role of immigration in the campaign a lot. So how do you think that is playing out in the campaign in the context of what we've already talked about?
I mean, I think there are so many fascinating and really disturbing ways in which immigration functions for Trump. So I think I'll start with the way in which it connects to the appeals to men and then kind of zoom out more broadly. So Trump, and I view this as very clear, Trump's rhetoric and Trump's actions when he was president were both very anti-undocumented immigration, but also more broadly anti-immigration. And I think people kind of overlooked that because so much of what he says about undocumented immigration is just so fascist, essentially, that it's really easy to overlook that there is a much broader rhetoric that he uses around all forms of immigration that is negative around immigration, and also that when he was president, he oversaw policies that reduced legal immigration and was very proud about doing that. Like, this is very front and center. The two things go together. And I found it very notable that in this election in particular, he's ramped up his perhaps somewhat clumsy appeals to Hispanic and African-American men by talking about the fact that legal immigrants are taking jobs from minorities. So he is making it really clear, kind of tapping into perhaps class consciousness, if you will, that competition for jobs with legal immigrants impacts men of color, essentially. And that's been kind of part and parcel of some of what he's been saying about legal immigrants taking jobs from Americans. He'll often stop and pause and say they're taking, black jobs, they're taking Hispanic jobs. And I think that is actually part of his appeal to men. He doesn't really talk about women and work. He's talking about men and work and family providers and work. And I really want to emphasize that this is hostility to all forms of immigration, because a lot of I think perhaps a lot of Australians or people outside the campaign assume that he's just talking about undocumented immigration, which has always been, politically fraught in the US, although not in the way that it is right now. But actually, he's just broadly hostile to immigrants. I'll add the caveat that obviously, given that he's married to women who are immigrants, that hostility is not uniform and probably has a fairly strong racial component. But it's not a hidden element. He often talks about immigrants as taking jobs or opportunities from America. He opposed various forms of visas, for example, various forms of student visas and sort of temporary working visas, because he viewed them as taking jobs from Americans. At one stage, he wanted to impose some kind of policy that would have made employers prioritize Americans over immigrants. And that's not about undocumented immigration. That is about hostility towards all forms of immigrants. And of course, his views on undocumented immigrants are, in some ways have only amplified since 2016. I mean, the world was incredibly shocked when he, in his first speech as a presidential candidate, talked about Mexico as sending murderers and rapists over the border.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
But things have gotten much, much, much worse since then in terms of his rhetoric. He's now routinely talking about undocumented immigrants as poisoning the blood of the country. And when it was pointed out to him that directly echoed rhetoric that Hitler had used in Mein Kampf, he said he didn't know that. But then he continued to use the phrase, so he can no longer claim that he doesn't know that. He talks about undocumented immigrants as animals. He talks about them as rapists. He talks about them as escapees from insane asylums. He also implies that other countries are sending criminals and lunatics, as he would put it, to the United States as some kind of dumping ground for the world. And he routinely uses the language of invasion to describe everything that's happened on the southern border. This is just a huge escalation in really, really overtly racist language. And I think what's deeply depressing about it perhaps is, whereas once this was really subject to a lot of comment in 2016, now most of it is just viewed as normal. It's not even really captured in the way that those rallies are reported.
But it is a historical departure, isn't it? Not just for politics generally, but for the Republican Party specifically.
Yes, it used to be that the Democrats were essentially the anti-immigrant party, and they had a long and not so proud history of that, particularly in the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan was very powerful within the Democratic Party. Democrats used to be the party that opposed immigration. And the Republicans tended to support immigration because it brought in workers, and that's what business wanted. And there's a long history of this. You can particularly look at policies in the 40s and through to the 60s, the kind of ways in which Republicans endorsed the easy flow of migrants. But I think what's particularly striking is if you contrast the rhetoric of Trump with more recent Republican figures. And there it's really stark. So Ronald Reagan, who until very recently was the kind of patron saint of all American conservatives, was incredibly sentimental about legal immigration. And he was also incredibly empathetic about undocumented immigration. So Reagan made speeches throughout his presidency where he essentially said that it was immigration that had made America forever young, forever bursting with energy and new ideas. It's a theme throughout his speeches that immigration is what has made America distinctive and vibrant and new. But he also repeatedly rejected efforts to demonize undocumented immigrants. He does this in the 1980 presidential debates, where he talks about a vision where essentially Mexican workers can cross the border to and fro for work. So what we might almost think of as open borders. He fundamentally rejected the idea of building a wall. He was asked point blank about it. He rejected it. He also, in 1984, when he was running for re-election, said that he rejected the idea of mass deportation or any form of deportation. And in fact, he endorsed the idea of granting asylum to the undocumented immigrants already in the country. There are about 3 million at that time. And moderate Republicans really worked very hard with Democrats to get legislation passed in 1986. That was the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And that does see about 2.7 million undocumented people, primarily of Latino descent, become citizens. They're on a pathway to citizenship out of that. So Reagan is very, very pro-immigration and very understanding of why people cross into the country unlawfully. And you see that again with George W. Bush, who in the 2000s campaigned several times, in both of the campaigns, is really clear that he supports further immigration reform. He talks in really kind of quite moving ways about the experiences of people crossing the border in the desert. Like, he really personalizes the way that he talks about it. He's very clear that he supports amnesty for undocumented immigrants in the country. He works very hard with then Arizona Senator John McCain to try and get legislation through that would have seen the naturalization of I think about 7 million undocumented immigrants. Like, this is both of these kind of Republicans. You've got 20, 30 years where the mainstream of the party, and here I'll call Reagan mainstream, supported immigration and wanted to see pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigration. They didn't necessarily want to lose control of the borders. So you do see this ramping up of border security motifs. But they did think that once people were in the country and they were paying taxes and they were contributing and they were working, that these were people who should be rewarded. And I do think that there's a kind of interesting tension, particularly for Reagan, where, he's so hostile to people on welfare and so hostile to people making claims on the state. But undocumented immigrants can't do that. So they're kind of like the ideal American subject. They represent the best of America because they're not trying to take anything from the government. I think there's a kind of interesting tension there around why he is so supportive of them, because he sees them as people who contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been some, I'm kind of hesitating to use the word interesting, just as you were, but work suggesting that a lot of Trump's policies would have an enormous detrimental economic impact in the United States because the economy is kind of reliant on that undocumented labor, particularly in the South. And Trump, as he does, of course, is skating around the issue. It's not in his interest to address it. I guess I'm interested in how you see Democrats responding to this kind of perceived strength of Trump, because as far as I can see, they're not taking that kind of Reagan line that you were outlining there. They're almost trying to kind of outmaneuver him from the right. Is that a fair assessment of what they're doing?
I think that's probably pretty fair. It seems as though rather than try and challenge the assumptions that underpin what he's saying, which is what they did in the past, they've just kind of ceded to the idea that the border is out of control, that it's somehow all their fault, even though illegal border crossings actually began in the last year of Trump's presidency, began to spike. And it does seem as though, having been unable to get legislation through this year, which they, I think, fairly blame Trump for, you have Biden essentially say that they're not going to process any asylum claims that come across the Mexican border. And given that large percentages of the undocumented immigration from countries like Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador have been asylum claims, that's a really big statement to say that they're no longer going to allow people to seek asylum at the southern border. That is definitely a kind of rightward pivot, I think, and it does run counter to what you might argue are the kind of obligations of the US under its own laws around asylum and refugee seeking. So I do think that they don't view this as an area where they can put forward a different narrative, and I think that's pretty depressing, actually. And again, it's just a sign of the ways in which Trump's framing has really become the dominant framing on this particular issue. There's also evidence that significant percentages of Americans now want to see all forms of immigration reduced and things like that. And again, these are jumps really only in the last few years where we're starting to see this kind of spike where people are saying, yes, there are too many immigrants in our country, full stop. I also think there's a kind of interesting tension where people don't think of these debates as relating to them if they're, second or third generation immigrants. So there's some evidence, I think, that Trump's appeals, particularly around people taking jobs or doing things the wrong way to come into the country, that is somewhat appealing to Hispanic voters who are lawfully in the country, that kind of rhetoric has kind of been seen to connect with perhaps some feelings of resentment. And you can also presume that resentment comes from the fact that, Hispanics are really extraordinarily racialized in these debates. They all get caught up in these debates and kind of viewed as the other. But rather than viewing Trump as the cause of this kind of framing, there's hostility directed towards undocumented immigrants. But I think a lot of Trump's policies, like mass deportation and whatnot, not only would they have an incredibly destabilizing impact on the economy, but they would also almost by extension have an incredibly destabilizing impact on, ordinary Hispanic and Latino Americans, because we know when there was kind of quite draconian laws passed at the state level in places like Arizona under sort of Tea Party rulers, basically anyone who was brown-skinned was stopped and made to kind of prove that they could be in the country under some of those kinds of policies. And I think people don't necessarily understand the logistics of how this would play out if it comes to pass. I also think there's this kind of weird, ugly tension that has existed in the US, certainly since the 1990s, this kind of fear of the browning of America, which, prominent public intellectuals talked about in the 90s. And again, it's this kind of normalized account that, I think many Americans perhaps share, is that the increased percentage of Hispanic people in the country is somehow a kind of threat to what America is. And again, all these kind of themes predate Trump, this kind of fear of the South or fear of invasion. A lot of this language was used in the late 20th century. It's just it was rejected by Republican politicians, for example, who at a federal level don't tend to lean into that language. It's at the state level, particularly in places like Arizona and Texas, that you do see local politicians really embrace this us and them othering kind of framework, which I think now has just spread across the country and become incredibly normalized.
And I think also really demonstrates the deep and intrinsic links between immigration and reproductive rights, because as you're outlining there, the so-called Great Replacement theory, which is obviously grounded in white supremacy, part of the white supremacist answer to that is that white women need to have more babies, which I think leads us into reproductive rights.
Yeah, I think it's a really murky place. So on the one hand, J.D. Vance, who has said several things that really seem very flirtatious with Great Replacement theory, will then point to the fact that his Indian wife is the children of immigrants and, that his own children are biracial and, has complained about white supremacists attacking his wife and his children. And you think, but don't you understand that the framing and the rhetoric that you use around the birth rate is the framing and rhetoric that white supremacists have embraced wholesale internationally, not just in the US. So a lot of this kind of discussion around reproduction and the birth rate is very much a kind of emphasis that certain kinds of people should have more children. It would be very rare for a Republican politician to be encouraging non-white women to have more children. Those people get coded as welfare queens if they have more than a certain number of children. And, there's a long history of intrusion upon reproductive rights for women of colour, including, histories of forced sterilisation and forced contraceptive use tied to welfare and things like that. So I think the Great Replacement theory, which is, again, just a kind of more overtly white supremacist articulation of the kind of fear of the browning of America, is very tied to reproduction. I also will note that Trump, for example, has repeatedly vowed to end birthright citizenship, which is, he claims would end what conservatives refer to as anchor babies, so undocumented people having children who are American by birth. Despite the fact that his policy contravenes the 14th Amendment, this is front and center of something he says he will just do. And that's also obviously an attack on the reproductive lives of undocumented women.
Yeah, absolutely. And last time we spoke, you spoke in great detail about how strong Harris in particular was on reproductive rights, on this issue, broadly speaking. Is that still the case, do you think?
Look, I think she is still very strong on reproductive rights. And I think Tim Walz was a very good choice of running mate because he very passionately articulates a kind of male perspective around reproductive rights, both just as a partner, a heterosexual partner, but also as, the father of a daughter. I do think that there were a few missteps, perhaps, where in the debate between Walz and Vance, some of the ways that Walz described support for abortion rights did seem to be kind of ceding ground. No one's pro-abortion was a thing that he said. And that kind of really echoed the Hillary Clinton language of, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, which Republicans ran with ad infinitum. In some ways, that was a little bit disappointing, I have to say, because Kamala's been so strong on just framing abortion as a kind of matter of human rights and healthcare, and has really kind of foregrounded very, not just pro-choice, but I would say kind of pro-abortion framings around how do we talk about this issue in a way that's really person-centered, rather than this kind of more politicized debate. But I think that was a fairly rare misstep within the campaign about how they talk about these issues. And I think in general, Harris is really focused on emphasizing just, it's a consistent theme in her campaign that what she calls the Trump abortion bans are, killing people, essentially. She's talked with great compassion about the woman who died in Georgia after trying to seek abortion care and being turned away. She's really, really centered the stories of individuals and how she talks about the impact of these abortion bans. And she has really been unrelenting in calling them Trump bans. And, Trump doesn't like that framing. He would rather just blame state-level Republicans and claim to have nothing to do with what's been going on. But Harris has really prosecuted that, if you'll pardon the language.
Of course, always. Trump, I think, as you were getting at there, doesn't seem to know how to respond. He kind of alternates between owning the overturning of Roe v. Wade through his appointment of conservative justices to the Supreme Court and then attempting to walk it back, recognising that he's got a big electoral problem with women. We're looking at a historic gender gap. But, doesn't seem to be able to walk that line and to simultaneously reassure women that he's not going to oversee something like a national abortion ban while still appealing to those white men that we were talking about before, who are listening to, what did you call it, Manosphere podcasts. How do you think his response is tracking?
Look, I think that the American media have shown a kind of certain level of naivety consistently on every issue in how they deal with Trump. So that's a blanket statement. But I think it's been quite pronounced on his statements around abortion. So people have treated, credulously his claims that he wouldn't ban abortion. Which he's now finally said that he wouldn't sign off on a national ban. And you think, well, actually, Right to Life groups have been talking about what they call a national standard. And that's the language they use, that there should be a national standard around abortion. That's clearly a ban. You just need to interrogate what they mean by that to understand that he can say he doesn't support a ban, but he's not being asked, does he support a minimum national standard? Or, there's these kind of ways in which a lot of Trump's statements around what he would or would not do are just repeated without any kind of interrogation or contextual framing. You know, like, for example, his repeated claims that he's not involved with Project 2025, and yet JD Vance's association with Project 2025 are so well documented, yet he continues to kind of assert that they're separate. So therefore, any planning in Project 2025 is really nothing to do with him. You know, there's these kind of gaps. Similarly, you know, he claimed a few days ago that he's the father of IVF, which he then also said he was joking. But he has repeatedly said that he, you know, supports IVF, that he would absolutely not ban IVF. He's pointed approvingly to the Alabama state legislature, which immediately moved to protect IVF after the Alabama court said that embryos had personhood rights or whatever. But actually, like, look at his choice of JD Vance, look at what Republicans are doing in practice to see what would happen. It's not just what he says, you have to look at what they're doing in practice. And there have been 2 votes this year about a bill that would have protected access to IVF nationally in Congress. The first one, JD Vance joined all the Republicans, voted against it. And the second one in September, he just didn't vote. And JD Vance has criticized IVF in other forums. So again, there's what Trump says, and then there's all the things that are happening in reality, not just kind of in rhetoric. And it's really disappointing to see the focus on what Trump says, which I think many of us know is kind of just meaningless. It's just filler. He says a lot, and he'll always back away from anything that's controversial. I think we need to be looking at what the party is doing in practice to get a sense of what's actually happening or what might happen.
So you mean we shouldn't put too much faith in Melania Trump to moderate her husband's position?
Oh my God. I think the fact that people thought that meant anything shows the lack of literacy or lack of history. Barbara Bush was pro-choice. Laura Bush was allegedly pro-choice. Supposedly Nancy Reagan was pro-choice. And, you know, we now know that apparently behind the scenes, Nancy Reagan, you know, did have empathy for patients with AIDS and did try and get her husband to do something. That doesn't mean anything. And I think the timing of Melania Trump's memoir publication is such a kind of overt attempt to appease wary white women voters. And yet it was all reported as like, oh, she's throwing Donald under the bus, she's broken with him. I'm like, it's bizarre and frankly really disappointing that no one is pointing out this long history of Republican women who are pro-choice with anti-abortion husbands.
It is. It's kind of outrageous, I think. Prudence, one of the other things we spoke about last time you were on the show is the global ramifications of all of this happening in the United States, particularly the global ramifications of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and I guess the way that emboldened the far right, particularly in the United States, but across the world. I know you've been keeping a really close eye on what's happening in Australia in that context, and particularly what's happened in the last few weeks in Queensland and South Australia. So I wondered if you wanted to reflect a little bit on those really important connections as well.
I have many, many thoughts, but I will try to keep them under control. I think Queensland is perhaps the most interesting. So I might start with that because in some ways, I think what we see in Queensland is a kind of mirroring of Trump's dance around abortion. So the Queensland LNP, the vast majority of Queensland LNP members voted against decriminalisation in 2018, and they did so with very, very explicit anti-abortion language. So their language wasn't that they had a problem with this bill. Many of them talked about abortion as murder in the debate. So that's, you know, documented that that's their perspective. Then in 2020, the LNP ran with a pledge that they would revisit the recently passed decriminalisation legislation. So that was part of their campaign strategy. They were very clear that that was a party priority. And then they didn't win. And just as an aside, Queensland is more conservative, perhaps, particularly in some of its federally elected members. But there's very consistent pro-choice support for decriminalisation. And, you know, this year there was very consistent across the state support for abortion decriminalisation. So there was a poll from a few weeks ago that found that about 75% of Queenslanders supported decriminalisation, 73% of LNP members supported decriminalisation, and 78% of regional Queenslanders supported decriminalisation. So there's broad pro-choice majorities there. So that in 2024, the LNP are not talking about what they want to do with abortion. In fact, they've been kind of engaged in a somewhat humorous dance to try and not answer that question. They were eventually kind of compelled to say that they didn't have a plan to do anything, that it wasn't part of their plan. And of course, then you have Robbie Katter come along as an independent party, be a kind of spoiler and say that he would immediately introduce a conscience vote on the matter. And now what I think was LNP strategy to allow a conscience vote has kind of been brought to voters' attention. And I think it's really interesting because in some ways this shows what they've learned from the kind of Trump model. Just listen to what I say. Don't look at what I do. Don't look at my past statements. Just listen to what I'm saying now and be pacified. And I think probably the Robbie Katter thing has been a source of real annoyance and grievance for the LNP, who were having a very, very easy, seemingly path to victory against what I think is a 4-term Labor government. So I think that that's a kind of interesting thing, not just the importation of the rhetoric, and certainly Robbie Katter has really cloaked himself in a very specific type of anti-abortion rhetoric for some time that comes out of the US. Earlier this year, he introduced a Born Alive bill in Queensland that kind of mirrored something that Alex Antic and Matt Canavan did federally last year, and which comes from an American model of legislation. So there's a very clear US influence, but I also think there's ways in which this kind of flirtation with trying to seem moderate on abortion very much echoes what Trump has done or is doing right now. And then the South Australian context, I think, is interesting because it reflects a different type of anti-abortion strategy. So in South Australia, a Liberal Conservative in what is our upper house introduced a bill that would have essentially been a ban on abortion after 28 weeks, but did so with particularly polarizing rhetoric where he talked about babies being induced at 28 weeks and then placed up for adoption. And the bill is actually, it would have banned any form of abortion for any reason after 28 weeks. So it would have also meant the live birth of, very unwell infants who would just, die a painful death, basically. So very, very weird bill, I have to say, actually not in keeping with US strategies. But the tactics behind it, I think, are just verbatim American tactics, because there was no way this bill was ever going to pass the lower house. That was really understood. Labor dominates the lower house. And although it's a conscience vote, there's quite a lot of kind of Labor left in the lower house. So it was just never going to go anywhere. Was a bit of a shock, I think, to many people outside South Australia that it was so close in the upper house, given how badly framed the bill was and how criticised it was. But I think we should view this as what Americans call messaging bills. So the US Right to Life movement has this long history before Roe v. Wade fell of introducing messaging bills that can never pass, and if they were passed, would not have been constitutional. But the point is to keep abortion in the news, to get to talk about abortion in really stigmatizing and polarizing ways, and to energize conservative voters. And I think that is exactly what was happening here. That bill had no prospects. What it does is message things about the person who moved it and message things about a kind of broader conservative takeover that's happening at the state level here in the Liberal Party.
Yeah, wow. And one of many examples of how there aren't nice, clean dividing lines between domestic politics and foreign policy and our relationship with the United States. So thank you so much for highlighting those connections and drawing people's attention to them in a way that just doesn't really happen, I think, in mainstream media coverage. So we will keep watching that and hope to check in with you, Prudence, maybe after the election. We don't have very long to go. We're all watching with bated breath. So thank you so much for coming on the show again in what is, I know, such a crazy busy time for you.
Thanks for having me. I always love the opportunity to talk through these issues.
This episode was recorded on Monday, the 21st of October, and no doubt a lot will have changed since then. I think technically we're still waiting for that October surprise. If you're enjoying After America, please help us spread the word by telling your friends about the show. You can find us on social media. We're at the Oz Institute. That's with an AUS on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to hear more from the Australia Institute, you can subscribe for regular updates via the link in our show notes. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next Tuesday. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.